another Sheriff of Sodium video. Every 2 years, the National Resident Matching Program puts out detailed reports on how applicant qualifications influence outcomes in the match. This year, the NRMP put out 3 reports, totaling 799 pages of glorious charts and data on graduating MD students, graduating DO students, and international medical graduates. The reports came out in August, but this year when they came out, I was on clinical service and writing letters of recommendation and doing about a half dozen other things. So even though a number of you reached out and asked me to comment, I just honestly didn't have the bandwidth at that time. So like a special treat, I put aside the reports and I saved them for a time when I knew I could really enjoy them. And this week that time came, and enjoy them I did, because each one is a treasure trove of interesting tidbits that can help us understand the current state and future trends in residency selection, and just plain interesting and fun things about statistical interpretation. So you know what that means. Yes, sir, you are correct. It is time to break it down, winners and losers style. First up, a winner. The "What about urology and ophthalmology?" reply guys. See, one time-honored tradition on my social media feed is that whenever the NRMP drops new data, I'll make a graphic, maybe something like this one, which shows the match rates for different specialties. And as soon as I post it, some people chime in and ask why I left out ophthalmology or urology. And the answer, of course, is that ophthalmology and urology have their own matching services, so the NRMP doesn't have those data, and they can't really tell us anything about what the profile of those applicants look like or what their outcomes are. But maybe, just maybe, that may be changing. Let me show you something. This is a screenshot from the 2024 NRMP Main Residency Match Report. I took this screenshot when the report came out back in the spring. One thing that immediately caught my eye was that there were a number of tables like this one, this 8C, which included rows for ophthalmology and urology. Only the numbers listed were zeros for each year. Naturally, I wondered why the NRMP would put this in there, so I asked them, and I didn't get a response. By the next time I looked at the tables in July, they looked different. Actually, if you pull up the NRMP report right now, you'll see a table that looks like what I'm showing you on the right, with no entries for ophthalmology and urology. And eventually I heard back from an NRMP official who told me that this was a mistake and someone caught it after the report was posted, so they pulled it down and just removed those 2 lines. But why someone would have added those lines in the first place remains a mystery, so here I can only speculate. Is the AUA going to start using the NRMP to match future urologists? Is the NRMP going to start reporting data for ophthalmology applicants who match to their PGY1 prelim year position through the NRMP? Who knows? But the fact that these lines appeared, even transiently in the NRMP report, makes me think that the ophthalmology and urology reply guys may be able to get some data from the NRMP in the near future. Next, another winner. The "I never matched today" guys. The NRMP's been putting out charting outcomes reports for 15 years now, and so whenever the new data drop, it is a special day for online people who matched in a competitive specialty years ago. Did you hear that only 69% of MDs and only 21% of DOs matched in neurosurgery? Or that half of all dermatology matches are members of AOA, or that the average Step 2 CK score for diagnostic radiology was 256, or that the average MD who matched in orthopedic surgery now has an average of 24 abstracts, publications, and presentations. Man, these students today, I'm telling you, I'd never match if I was applying today. And obviously there is a certain truth to this. I mean, the radiologists and dermatologists and surgical specialists of different varieties who usually make these comments, they probably wouldn't match today. Or at least they wouldn't match if they applied with exactly the same credentials that they did 10 or 20 years ago. But what everyone needs to understand is that the reason it's tougher to match today isn't because there's more applicants. Actually, if you watched my Fact Police video last year on residency applicants and residency positions, you already know that objectively, there's probably never been a better time to apply to residency in recent memory than right now. The reason it's tougher to match is because of the progression of the residency selection arms race. Whatever you can measure, applicants have more of it today than they did in the past. Today's applicants have higher USMLE scores, more research experience, more away rotations, more of whatever it is, simply because other applicants have more of those things too. And that actually leads naturally to my next winner, the mean. If you've been on social media over the past month, you already know that the biggest splash from the new charting outcomes was this chart number 9 from the MD report. This graphic shows the average number of research abstracts, presentations, and publications for applicants who matched and didn't match in the major specialties. So here in one graphic is the current state of the research arms race in residency selection. In 2024, the average number of research items for a successful applicant in orthopedic surgery was 23.8. For dermatology, 27.7. Plastic surgery, 34.7. For neurosurgery, 37.4 abstracts, presentations, and publications. Now, if those numbers don't make your eyes pop out of your skull, then let me give you a little bit of historical perspective and see if that doesn't loosen them up a bit. What I'm showing you now is the same chart from the 2014 Charting Outcomes report. And you look at this, and it's like comparing the Appalachians to the Rocky Mountains. I mean, nowadays, the average anesthesiology or radiology applicant has 3 times as many research items as they did just 10 years ago. And actually, for most specialties, the average unmatched applicant today has more research output than the average matched applicant did in 2014. If you didn't match in general surgery or psychiatry last year, you probably still had twice as many research items as someone who matched in 2014. But if you're an applicant and you're looking at this and you're thinking, oh, I'm never going to match, let me just highlight that the statistic the NRMP is sharing here is the mean. And the mean is a good measure of central tendency for normally distributed variables, but it's pretty hard to believe that research items would be that. In all likelihood, for most specialties, there's going to be a very skewed distribution because of a relatively small number of applicants with a ton of research output. In other words, more than half of all applicants are still going to match with a less than average number of research items. Pointing this out, it does make you wonder whether applicants would be better served if the NRMP reported the median and an interquartile range, not just for this, but for many data that get reduced to a single value in charting outcomes. But for now, the mean is king. Before I move on from research, let me call out one last winner, the least publishable unit. The least publishable unit is the winner because, honestly, it's hard for me to think of another winner in the research arms race. I mean, the applicants certainly aren't winning. I don't think programs are winning. I mean, all the time and effort that's going into publishing these surveys and case reports, I mean, that time could have gone toward acquiring skills that might have been of greater utility when these folks actually start taking care of patients. I mean, unless I guess the program director just really wants to be the senior author on a few more papers and curious. And I don't think science at large is winning either. I mean, maybe some of this burgeoning medical student research output will go on to change the world, but honestly, most of it will probably end up as just sparingly cited research pollution. So really, the only winner I see, because of the way that the NRMP aggregates data for research abstracts, presentations, and publications, is the least publishable unit. Because the surest way to make those numbers climb even higher by the time that the 2026 Charting Outcomes report comes out is to make sure that every budding physician scientist knows the value of salami slicing your data into the smallest unit that you could turn into a line on your CV. I mean, why would you write one paper when the elements of that paper could be broken up into 2 papers, plus 3 or 4 abstracts at 2 or 3 different meetings? I mean, the future physician who demonstrates this kind of mastery over the least publishable unit, they are showing you that they are ready to succeed in academic medicine. Rank to match. Next up, our first loser, bad interviewees. There's another arms race in residency selection that doesn't get talked about as much as the research arms race or the USMLE arms race, and that's the arms race to get more and more interviews. Now, I've talked about this here, and so I won't bore you by giving you all the details again, but suffice to say, another way that applicants compete with each other is by trying to go on more and more and more residency interviews. 20 years ago, the average residency applicant ranked about 8 programs. 10 years ago, they ranked about 12. Nowadays, in most specialties, many or most applicants are completing more than 16 interviews. which is where the NRMP stops counting. Charting outcomes breaks this down for us by specialty, just like you see here. Just for sake of example, I decided to show you OBGYN. Now the x-axis shows you the number of contiguous ranks that an applicant put on their rank order list, which is a reasonable surrogate for the number of interviews they completed. Now notice on the far right that last bar. The single highest peak on this histogram is for applicants who submitted 16 or more contiguous ranks. But the NRMP also breaks down the match rate for each group, and that actually gets me to the point that I want to make here. So notice that 194 of these applicants who interviewed at 16 or more places matched, but 4 didn't. So if you're a residency applicant and you're watching this video, let me tell you something about that. If you are an applicant and you get 16 interview offers, you clearly have the credentials to match. You've bypassed the initial screening at many programs. And if you get an interview, you should expect that you will be on the program's rank order list, because no program would choose to waste their faculty's time by having them interview people who they don't really think are going to match into their program. But every year, there are a small number of people who disqualify themselves from ranking by performing poorly at the interview. Now here I just used OBGYN for sake of example, but charting outcomes tells a similar cautionary tale for most other specialties too. My point is this: if you look at the factors that programs use to rank applicants, the number one most important thing is how they did in the interview. And yet, after all the time and toil that many applicants spend in medical school and preparing their ARIS application, some underprepare or don't seek out constructive criticism or don't realize how they look or sound or are coming off to other people, and they suffer for it. Don't let it happen to you. Next, a loser: anesthesiology applicants. See, if you haven't gathered this already, I probably spent a little bit too much time looking through historical NRMP data and stuff like that. But one interesting thing to me is that through most of recent history, the ordinal relationship among specialties' popularity is more or less preserved. I mean, what I mean is that although things may fluctuate a bit, in general, specialties that are highly sought after by applicants in one era, they tend to remain highly sought after in other eras. And less popular specialties, they tend to stay less popular. But there are a couple of exceptions, and the biggest one by far that swung from one extreme to another is anesthesiology. Let me show you some data from the 1996 NRMP match. That year, there were 960 anesthesiology positions offered. And you know how many of them filled? 324. That is 35%. 35%. I mean, let me put that in perspective for you. Do you remember in 2023 when 18% of emergency medicine positions went unfilled and people nearly lost their damn minds? Well, in 1996, nearly 2 out of 3 anesthesiology positions went unfilled. Anesthesiology wasn't just unpopular, it was at a historic level of unpopularity. Back then, there was real concern that nurse anesthetists were going to make anesthesiologists unnecessary, and they couldn't find people to fill these positions. But obviously, time has shown that that has not occurred, and so now the pendulum has swung hard in the other direction. Last year, every single anesthesiology position was filled in the match. And look at what's happened to match rates for anesthesiology applicants. Just since 2018, the MD senior match rate has dropped from 96% to 85%. The DO senior match rate has dropped even farther, from 90% to 58%. Match rates for IMGs are now under 50%. And actually, I fully expect that these numbers are going to drop further in the next couple of cycles. But speaking of unfilled positions, that brings me to my next loser: pediatrics. Last year, 8% of categorical pediatric residency positions went unfilled. Now, this was not a surprise to viewers of this channel because I've highlighted how the number of applicants in pediatrics has been declining over the past decade, but actually the new charting outcomes includes one piece of data that shows that the situation is actually even worse than I thought, and I'm not going to lie, I already thought it was pretty bad. See, one thing that complicates the interpretation of applicant data from ARIS or the NRMP is the fact that many applicants apply to more than one specialty. So when you look at the raw number of applicants, you have no way of knowing how many of them actually dream of being in that specialty and how many applicants might just be applying as a backup. But the NRMP knows. They know what's in an applicant's heart because they know what specialty an applicant ranked number 1. So all the statistics they present in charting outcomes, they report those according to an applicant's preferred specialty. So here's the ratio of applicants to positions for pediatrics when you consider only the applicants who want to match in pediatrics. Back in 2014, there were 1.2 applicants who actually wanted to be pediatricians for every position that was available in the match. But that figure's been in decline, and last year it dropped to 0.93. In other words, at least 7% of pediatric residency positions are going to go unfilled or be filled by someone for whom pediatrics was, at best, their second choice specialty. This graphic shows you how that figure compares to other specialties. In 2024, there were only 4 specialties that have fewer applicants that want to match in the specialty than they have positions, and only one of those specialties is lower than pediatrics. Now, you need to interpret this trend alongside the fact that the ACGME just imposed new program requirements in pediatrics that dramatically reduce the amount of time that pediatric residents get to spend on inpatient care. And naturally, the way that many pediatric residency programs are planning to respond to this is by increasing their class size so that they can continue to provide wall-to-wall resident coverage inside the hospital. In other words, at the same time that authentic first-choice interest in pediatrics is at an all-time low, we're about to embark on an unprecedented major expansion of pediatric residency programs. I think it's a treacherous position for any specialty to be in. Before I move on from backup specialties, let me introduce another winner. Correlation does not equal causation. There's a lot of useful data in charting outcomes, but some of them, by the way that they're presented, you got to make sure that you don't jump to the wrong conclusion. Let me give you an example that just came up recently in the comments to another video. Here I'm showing you chart 5 from the MD report, and it shows the average number of different specialties that an applicant ranked for applicants who matched, which are the blue bars, and applicants who didn't match, which are the green bars. And you'll notice that for every specialty, the green bars are at least a little bit higher, meaning that applicants who are unmatched, they apply to more backup specialties than applicants who do match. So it's tempting when the data get presented like this to conclude that people are going unmatched because they're applying to more backup specialties. I mean, maybe the program director somehow sniffed out that they weren't really committed to the specialty. Maybe they applied to multiple programs at the same institution and the program directors got to talking to each other. Or maybe they wrote 2 different personal statements and then they mixed them up when they submitted their application. I mean, there are ways that applying to multiple specialties could hurt your application, so when you see a graphic like this, you might conclude that maybe you shouldn't do it. But of course, there's a far more likely explanation, which is that this observation is just due to confounding. Remember, these are observational data. The NRMP isn't randomizing applicants to apply to one specialty or more than one specialty. They're just telling us what happened when people made the choices that they made. And applicants make choices for a reason. And applicants are smart. And the choices that they make are in their best interest. So people who do it, they do it because they think they might not match in their preferred specialty. And they probably have reasons for thinking that. So if you look at the groups of matched and unmatched applicants, they're going to differ systematically in lots of ways that impact the applicant's likelihood of matching. If you would honestly be happy matching in more than one specialty, you should apply in more than one specialty. And if you want to understand the simple logic and game theory behind that in the modern era of signaling, check out my video on strategic preference signaling, which is how this came up. But the point that I'm making here actually applies to a lot of charting outcomes data and observational data in general. Correlation does not equal causation. In fact, how to properly interpret charting outcomes data is one of the big themes that I want to get across in this video. But before I talk more about what I want, I'm going to talk about a little bit more about what many of you want, which is more analysis of specialty trends. But here it's a push. I mean, there were a couple of other potentially notable specialty trends that jumped out at me, but whether these trends are going to be sustained or not is not entirely clear. One that struck me is the rising popularity of pathology. Look what's happened to the number of applicants to positions over the past few cycles. I mean, this is the opposite of the pediatrics story, with a ratio that's increased from 1.15 in 2018 to 1.5 in 2024. Another is the rising popularity of diagnostic radiology, which has always been a competitive but a somewhat cyclical specialty. But what's striking to me this year is how diagnostic radiology compares to interventional radiology. Now, obviously, many aspiring radiologists apply to both IR and DR programs, but it wasn't long ago that IR was the hottest specialty in the match, and IR programs had their choice of the most accomplished radiology applicants. Look at these data from 2018, when the match rate in IR was 58%. Notice how the applicants who matched in interventional radiology were objectively more polished than those who matched in diagnostic radiology. They had higher USMLE scores, more research, more AOA, more famous medical schools, you name it. But look how that's changed. Now, many highly accomplished applicants seem to prefer diagnostic radiology. Because again, most of these applicants are applying to both types of programs, but the NRMP presents the data based on an applicant's preferred specialty. In 2024, applicants with higher Step 2 CK scores or more AOA, they seem to be choosing diagnostic radiology. Here's another one I frequently get asked about, which is radiation oncology. This comes up because, in many ways, it's the opposite of the anesthesiology story. You go back 15 or 20 years and radiation oncology was among the most competitive specialties, but for the past few years, radiation oncology positions have been available in abundance in the SOAP, because there's been a rapid increase in available positions at the same time that there was waning interest from applicants because of concerns about the job market and whether advances in chemotherapy are going to reduce the role of radiation. But there might be some gentle swinging of the pendulum back. Look how match rates have started to decline, just barely, over the past few cycles, and the ratio of applicants to positions is now back up to 0.99. Should I go one more? All right, fine. Here's one more I'm following. If I asked you what was the most competitive non-surgical specialty, what would you say? I mean, if you'd asked me that question, I would have said anesthesiology or diagnostic radiology. And if I had said those things, I would have been close, but actually, the answer is physical medicine and rehabilitation. At least it is if you define competitiveness by the lowest match rate. Last year, only 84.8% of MD seniors matched in pm&r. But this mention of competitiveness, well, that leads me naturally to the next loser, which is X is more competitive than Y debates. So like I said, when the charting outcomes data dropped, I did my best to try to ignore discussion about them because I wanted to be able to nerd out on the full reports without having my headspace cluttered with other people's bad takes. But X in particular kept trying to tempt me by showing me posts and replies from people arguing about whether one specialty was more competitive than another, or whether a given specialty was more competitive a few years ago than it is today. And so I decided I'd go ahead and say something quickly about all that. The first thing that I want to say is that debating about competitiveness is foolish. And it's foolish in part because there's multiple ways you can define competitiveness. But it's also foolish because it's a meaningless debate. And I mean the word meaningless in the sense that the answer to the debate has no meaning in the grand scheme of human experience. Because, let me tell you something. Regardless of what specialty you choose, when you match into that specialty, if fortune favors you and you make it not just through the match, but to the end of your training, there's going to come a day where you get to show up for work. And your job's going to be whatever it is. When you turn up in the OR to provide anesthesia for the first case of the day, you really won't have any extra bounce in your step if you matched in anesthesiology in 2024 when it was hot, or in 1996 when it wasn't. And if you're the orthopedic surgeon on the other side of the curtain, it really will not matter one bit to you how many people went unmatched in your year. I mean, you got a job to do, and either you love it or you don't. And I hope you love it, but whether you will or won't really has nothing to do with how many other people had their hearts broken on match day or how many silly hoops you had to jump through to get there. But because I know my correct and accurate philosophical assessment will not stop people from debating what's the most competitive specialty, I figured I'd just go ahead and tell you what it is. Because if you look at charting outcomes data, there are really 5 specialties that really exist in a different universe in terms of their applicant qualifications. You can see them here in the peaks of this graphic that I showed you before on research items. On average, and on paper, applicants in dermatology, neurosurgery, orthopedic surgery, otolaryngology, and plastic surgery look very different than applicants to other specialties. And the same thing would be true if we looked at their average USMLE Step 2 CK scores. So to break the tie, I plotted every specialty by the percentage of matched applicants who attended one of the top 40 medical schools according to NIH funding, and by the percentage of matched applicants who were members of AOA. And once again, you can see that these 5 specialties are completely set out from the others in terms of the average profile of applicants who match. But only dermatology had more than 40% of matched applicants who were AOA, and more than 40% of matched applicants from the top 40 medical schools. So here it is now scientifically proven that dermatology is the most competitive specialty, and I will not be taking any further questions. Next, another loser, additional degrees. Let me show you table 2, because there's a couple of interesting numbers there. One that tells us something about residency selection, and one that's just a cool example of something interesting in biostatistics. So this table compares the profile of USMD seniors who matched on the left and those who didn't match on the right. And most of the numbers there are not very exciting. I mean, you're not going to be surprised to learn that applicants who match have more stuff on average than applicants who don't. I mean, they get more interviews and have more programs to rank. They have higher USMLE scores. They're more likely to be an AOA or to have graduated from one of the top 40 medical schools. But there are 2 numbers that seem a little bit out of place, and I've got them highlighted here in red boxes. The first is that overall, unmatched applicants actually have more research output than matched applicants. Now, isn't that weird? The unmatched applicants have, on average, 11 abstracts, presentations, and publications, and the matched applicants have only 10. And the other interesting numbers down at the bottom. Applicants with another graduate degree are less likely to match than applicants who just have a plain old MD. And here the NRMP is not talking about MD PhDs because those are tallied up separately. They're talking about applicants with an MD MPH or an MD JD or an MD MBA. Now, isn't that strange too? I mean, you'd think that having more research or more academic degrees ought to help you match, right? So what's going on here? Let's take on research output first because we've already looked at this chart a few times. So here, instead of considering all matched and all unmatched applicants in the aggregate, this graphic shows us subgroups of applicants broken down by their preferred specialty. And what you see is that applicants with more research output have an advantage in essentially every specialty. The only one that might appear to be an exception is pediatrics, but before you read anything into that, let me just point out that there were exactly 2 unmatched MD applicants in pediatrics whose data got included in charting outcomes, and one of them was an MD PhD who had published a lot of papers, so that's why that green bar is so high. Anyhow, whether research output is beneficial or not is actually a great example of Simpson's paradox, which is a phenomenon that occurs when you see one effect in aggregate data, but that effect disappears or reverses when you examine subgroups. Now, you've probably already figured out why this is occurring here, but if you haven't, I'll quickly just spell it out. The overall group of matched applicants is enriched by a lot of applicants who may not have a whole lot of research output, but they're applying in specialties like internal medicine, pediatrics, emergency medicines, where match rates are high. So they match, and their relatively low research output lowers the mean for the entire group of matched applicants. In contrast, the group of unmatched applicants is enriched by a lot of applicants with very polished applications, but who are applying in those hyper-competitive specialties where there's a very real risk of going unmatched, regardless of how strong your application is on paper. So that's why we see more research output as being a negative factor in the aggregate data, but when we drill down into the subgroups, we get the real story. But there's no Simpson's paradox for dual degrees. I mean, look here at chart 14. When we break it down by specialty, we see the exact same pattern that we did in the aggregate data. There just doesn't seem to be any big match advantage for applicants with dual degrees, and in some specialties, having a dual degree would appear to be a negative predictor for successfully matching. Now, obviously, dual degree applicants, they may differ systematically from single degree applicants in lots of ways that could be relevant but aren't captured in a univariable analysis. But I'll tell you, I've still seen enough here to go ahead and put dual degrees in the losers column. Next, we've got not a winner or a loser, but a push. Anti-DO bias. One of the biggest headlines after last year's match was the rise in overall match rates for graduates of osteopathic medical schools. Now, actually, this has been a story for a while. The graphic I'm showing you here shows match rates for different groups of match applicants. And just look at that red line. Look how much it's moved upward over the past 30 years. The match rates for DOs has improved by 30 points. So in 2024, the match rates for DO seniors were at 92.3%. which was virtually identical to the 93.5% match rate for MD students. So wait, shouldn't anti-DO bias be a loser? Don't these data show us that maybe we've moved past all that? Not so fast, my friend, because if we break things down by specialty, charting outcomes paints a bit of a different picture. Here are the match rates for MD and DO seniors in their preferred specialty. And as you can see, in less competitive specialties like pediatrics, family medicine, emergency medicine, internal medicine, match rates are high and they're very similar for MDs and DOs. But the more competitive a specialty becomes, the more disparity you see between the MD and DO match rates. So in specialties like diagnostic radiology and OBGYN, there's around an 86% match rate for MDs and only around a 65% match rate for DOs. And for some of the most competitive specialties like plastic surgery and neurosurgery, the difference between DO and MD match rates is 50%. So wait, maybe anti-DO bias should be a winner. Don't these numbers show us that anti-DO bias is alive and well? Let me come back to this question in just a minute. But first, let me introduce another winner, U.S. citizen IMGs. It may seem funny to label U.S. citizen international medical graduates as a winner. According to Charting Outcomes, only 59.9% of U.S. IMGs match in their preferred specialty. Here's that same graphic I showed you a moment ago. The U.S. IMGs are the yellow line. And although their match rate is increasing, it's still way below the match rates for MDs and DOs. And here's the chart that I showed you a moment ago comparing match rates for MDs and DOs by specialty, only now I've added in US IMGs as the yellow bars. US citizens who aren't accepted to USMD and DO schools, or those who are accepted but choose for some reason to go to school overseas, they face much longer odds of matching into a residency program, especially in more competitive specialties. But a graphic like this doesn't tell the whole story, because there are systematic differences between MDs and DOs and IMGs that go beyond where they went to medical school, but are very relevant to their likelihood of success in residency selection. Let me show you what I mean. Here's the profile of applicants who successfully match into psychiatry. I chose psychiatry because I wanted a specialty where there was a relatively large number of matched and unmatched applicants for all three applicant groups. And what you see is that the successful MD applicants have the highest Step 2 CK scores. They're higher than the DOs, 246 to 240. And the DOs, in turn, have higher USMLE scores than the IMGs, who averaged 231. Same thing is true for research. The MDs have 7.5 research items. The DOs have 3.8, and the US citizen IMGs have only 3.4. And then in that third column, I've got the match rates, which go from 89% for MDs to 81% for DOs to 53% for the US citizen IMGs in psychiatry. Now let me show you the same chart for unmatched applicants. MDs who didn't match in psychiatry had an average Step 2 CK of 235 and 4.6 research items. And if you can remember back to the previous chart, those figures are still higher than the figures were for US IMGs who did match in psychiatry. Now the stats for the 19% of DOs who didn't match, they're slightly lower, and for the 47% of US IMGs who went unmatched in psychiatry, the average Step 2 score was 222, and they had 2.9 research items. And look, we can have a good, hearty debate about whether programs should use USMLE scores or research to select applicants, but in matter of fact, they do use these things. My point is, when you look at these data, it seems like differences in match outcomes for these groups are mediated by differences in applicant qualifications for these groups. But there is one group against which the U.S. citizen IMGs do consistently win, and that's the non-U.S. citizen IMGs. Now this graphic is straight out of Charting Outcomes, which shows the likelihood of matching into psychiatry for U.S. citizen and non-U.S. citizen IMGs based on their USMLE Step 2 CK score. Here the U.S. citizens are the blue line and the non-U.S. citizens are the green line. And what you see is that for any given level of Step 2 CK performance, the U.S. citizen IMG has a higher likelihood of matching. In general, the non-U.S. citizen IMG has to score about 15 or 20 points higher on Step 2 CK to have the same chance of matching as a given U.S. citizen IMG. And if you want to call this bias, I guess you could. But there may be several justifiable reasons why this pattern occurs. Most non-U.S. citizens require a work visa, which can make for some real bureaucratic headaches for the program, and unless there's a substantial difference in applicant qualifications, some programs may not just want to get into all that. So it's a soft call, but it's my YouTube channel, and I get to call it how I see it, and that's why I'm going to put U.S. citizen IMGs into the winners column. And that brings us to our next loser, whining about anti-DO bias. That chart I showed you a moment ago, the one that shows the difference between match rates for MDs and DOs, whenever I show that graphic on social media, it inspires certain senior faculty and deans and administrators from DO granting medical schools to just about blow a gasket talking about anti-DO bias. But like you smart people know, from the previous exercise that we just did, this graphic doesn't tell you the whole story because there are systematic differences in applicant qualifications between MD and DO applicants. So what we'd really like to know is, if we have two applicants with the same qualifications, would they have the same match rate? Now the NRMP could do this for us. They could make the same graphic that I just showed you, comparing U.S. citizen and non-U.S. citizen IMGs. But they don't. They keep everything for MDs and DOs separate. So we don't have quite the granularity of data that we need to authoritatively make that comparison, but they do give us enough to make a good first approximation. So that's what I tried to do here. I plotted the match rate by Step 2 CK score range for MD and DO applicants who were trying to match in OBGYN, general surgery, anesthesiology, and diagnostic radiology. I chose those specialties because they're all at least moderately competitive, and there's a big difference between MD and DO match rates. I mean, at least 15 or 20 percentage points, if not more. And as usual, the blue bars are the MDs and the red bars are the DOs. And what you can see is that for most of these specialties and at most levels of USMLE performance, the MDs have a slight advantage. Meaning, if you have two applicants with the same USMLE score, the one with the MD is more likely to match. But that difference is pretty small. I mean, the biggest effect seems to be in anesthesiology. I mean, look at the gaps between the blue and red bars there. But on the other hand, you look at general surgery, and those bars are almost equal. And yeah, not all DOs take the USMLE, and even if they did, MDs and DO applicants apply to overlapping but somewhat distinct types of programs within a given specialty. And even if their USMLE scores are similar, these groups could still differ systematically in research experience or other things that matter to program directors. But still. Now, before you go and say something goofy in the comments, I'm not saying that bias against DOs is gone. Actually, these graphs by themselves suggest that it's still here to some extent. But the magnitude of that effect seems overall to be small. And it's probably a lot smaller than what you'd suspect if you were just looking at the overall match rates for each of these specialties. I mean, what do you think these graphics would have looked like 10 years ago when the overall DO match rate was 80%? Or 20 years ago when it was 70%? I mean, I'd love to show you, but we don't have charting outcomes reports that go that far back, so you're just going to have to use your imagination and good judgment. There are undoubtedly still some programs that aren't much interested in having DO residents. Some of them even have program directors that'll tell you as much. But I think at more and more places, program directors are willing to seriously evaluate qualified DO applicants. And that's why I put whining about anti-DO bias in the losers column. I think it's working itself out. So if you're watching this video and you're a faculty member or a dean at an osteopathic medical school, and you get concerned when you see graphics like this, and you actually want to help the students, then you need to understand two things. The first is that whining about bias probably isn't going to help. The program directors who are biased against DOs, they're probably going to stay biased against DOs. Your yelling isn't going to change their mind. And actually, I think there's probably some risk that by talking about anti-DO bias, you actually make it worse. And if you want a case study on this, take a look at the literature on anti-drug advertising to adolescents in the late 1990s and early 2000s. There's no decrease in drug use. The kids who wanted to use drugs, they kept right on using drugs. The kids who were never going to use drugs, they continued to not use drugs. But for some small number of teenagers in the middle, the constant exposure to anti-drug messaging actually normalized the idea of using drugs, and drug use and intention to try drugs actually increased slightly. But the second, and probably the more important reason, is that complaining about anti-DO bias, it makes it seem like the solutions to the problem are beyond your control. I mean, the differences in match rates, they're someone else's fault, so it must be up to that person to fix it, right? I mean, just stop being biased. But like we've seen, most of the differences in match rates are mediated by differences in metrics that program directors care about. So if you're a dean and you want to improve your students' match rates, help your students prepare for standardized tests. Better yet, build up the structural support for research at your school so that your students can find mentors and projects and better compete in the research arms race. Or make sure all your students have access to high-quality clinical rotations with specialty faculty who are going to be willing to go to bat for them. You can't outsource that mentorship to away rotations. When you whine about anti-DO bias, you're placing the blame on someone else, but you're also putting the solutions to the problem out of your control. And many of the solutions are not out of your control. There are things you can do to help your students. And with that, I come to my final winner. Transparency. Like I said, I kind of missed the social media fray after the charting outcomes first dropped, but I did see little tidbits here and there, and one thing that kind of honestly took me aback was seeing people complain about the reports in general. I mean, I saw a few comments from people saying that these reports reduced applicants to numbers and that they increased applicants' stress, and I guess I quite don't know what to say about that. I mean, it's true. Residency selection is more than a numbers game. The metrics that charting outcomes describes, they're just the metrics that are most easily measured. And none of them are probably that good of a predictor of how good of a doctor you're going to be. And it's also true that residency selection can be a stressful process. But if you ask me, I think that stress is driven by the cruel reality that not everyone is going to get what they want. But that's just a mathematical fact. It's not something that's made better or worse by an organization providing descriptive statistics. I mean, if you personally find charting outcomes to be too reductive or too stress-inducing, I won't be mad at you if you choose to ignore it altogether. But I still think the fact that the NRMP provides these data is a good thing. There are certainly ways that they could present the data that might be more useful, and I at least lightly touched on a few of them here. But in residency selection overall, we have a problem with a lack of honesty and transparency. Many organizations, AMC, have actively chosen to remove useful data from the tools they provide for reasons that are frankly self-serving. And if you want to know more about that, please watch my video on ARIS and the financial conflict of interest at the AAMC. So I, for one, see charting outcomes as a win for transparency. And I think we'd all be better off if organizations and entities in the residency selection system followed suit. And folks, that's all I've got. Once again, thanks for listening.